Hi everyone, welcome. And if you're new here, my name is Kelly and I'm an indoor hydroponic gardener, but I also love to garden outside. I have a small patio behind me, and then stay tuned because in March 2025 or so, we're going to be moving out of our apartment into a house, and I'm going to be sharing some garden transformation videos and doing some native plant gardening and things like that. That yard is a disaster, the yard and garden, so stay tuned for that. So for today, we're going to focus on 10 tips on how to turn your patio or deck space into a garden. So just a little quick background. I've been growing on patios and decks for about 8 years now. My first garden was up on the 4th story of an apartment building, and that deck obviously had slits through it. So I had to be really careful when I watered my plants and my soil. There were actually things in my lease about that. So I got really big like saucers that go under plants, like extra large, so they catch more water. And I would also put down plastic or cardboard to catch the soil when I did anything with soil, just so it wasn't falling on the neighbors below. So a lot of these tips will still apply there. Just you might have to, amend how you set your plants up just to be mindful of the people below you. Okay, so for me, I'm on a 1st story apartment right now, so my patio is on ground level. So I don't really have to worry about that too much here. Okay, so let's start off. Here we go. So tip number 1 is just knowing what your hardiness zone is. And this applies only for perennial plants that come back the next year. Annuals, it doesn't really matter. Your hardiness zone, which I'll put a map up on the screen, is just pretty much saying how cold does it get in your area at its coldest. So I'm in zone 7B, and zone 7 is around like negative 10 to 12 degrees. So I can't get plants that would die if it got colder than that. So you have to, on the tab, when you go look at plants, you'll see it says, hopefully, it'll say what zone it is. And I think I'm going to put the example on here as zone 3 through 8. This is not one of my plants, it's just an example. So that means if you were to buy this plant and you lived, like me, in zone 7, you should be fine overwintering that plant here. Now, if you bought a plant that requires zones 9 or 10, where it doesn't get as cold in the winters, then you got to be a little bit more careful there, because those plants won't make it in your zone because it gets too cold. So be mindful of that. The other thing I want to mention about your zone is that when you grow on a patio or on a deck in pots or containers, those plants are more susceptible to the cold because there's no insulation really, unless you have a really big pot and a small plant with soil to insulate it. Those roots are going to be more exposed to the elements. So I've lost perennials that should have lived, but they didn't because they were in pots and it just got too cold and there's just less insulation. You can put your plants against your wall of your apartment that actually, or wherever you live, like the walls, so it's not as exposed. That helps too. Okay, so tip number 2, do you have a little cheat sheet down here? Is just know what your sun and shade amounts are on your space. So just a quick reference, my patio gets full afternoon sun. And I'm in northern Maryland, zone 7B, that is hot. So we've gotten like 110 plus heat index, and I've lost plants because of it. So that heat can be pretty brutal. So I have found over time there are certain plants that do really well in that afternoon sun and heat, like marigolds, which I know aren't native. I have some native ones that work really well, like ironweeds. But just be mindful of that, like how much sun and shade do you get on your patio, and take advantage of like those micro pockets of shade. My one patio wall is almost 80% plus shade, even in the afternoon, so I can grow shade plants there. It gets a little warmer, so you gotta find the right balance, but just knowing what your sun and shade is really helps. If you have afternoon shade and morning sun, you might be able to do something like hydrangeas, which do really well with some morning sun, but they don't like that afternoon heat. So that's my second tip for you. Okay, tip number 3 is just growing native plants for your area. You don't have to only grow native plants because they are sometimes finicky, especially in pots. But if you grow native plants, so plants that belong in, like, for example, a native plant to the East Coast, I'm going to use this example a lot, is New York ironweed. It is an amazing native plant. It grows back every year. I hardly have to take care of it besides just watering it. I mean, it's super resilient, super disease resistant, pest resistant. I never have any issues with it. So that's a great example of a plant to grow. So a plant that's native to your area, that belongs there. So I do have like my zinnia and marigolds, which are from more of like Central and South America, and they do okay here because they love that heat in the afternoon. But native plants are a good option. Okay, so I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything. Tip number 4 is use your vertical space. We have a 9-foot high patio, and I originally never put anything in a raised bed. I'll show you guys in the thumb picture of this video. You'll see like really dinky raised beds. But eventually I was like, let's get something a little more substantial. So I got some bigger raised beds. I put things up on pots, up on tables, up on bricks. I have a trellis that you can't see anymore because it's completely covered. Also, I don't know if this one's on there. On this one, oh, it is. So growing plant, like look at the plant heights. So how tall does that plant get? So my New York ironweed gets 8 feet tall. So it's like tucked away in the corner. And then in the front of my raised bed, I have plants that don't get more than about 4 feet tall. So they don't go above my raised bed. So using those spaces and filling those spaces in with plants that get tall, put those in the back, shorter plants in the front, then you can just have more plants in your space. Okay, so tip number 5 is staggering your blooms. So try and find plants that will bloom at different times of the spring, summer, and even maybe fall. There are some cold weather plants out there, flowers. So having plants that might bloom only in spring, early summer. Maybe you have a plant that blooms all summer, like my ironweed only blooms in late spring, early summer. But my zinnia, which I know is a native, is blooming all summer long. So having a variety of those blooms is really nice. Then you have color all year round, well, all summer long. Depending on where you live. I guess if you live in a warmer climate, you can have flowers longer. We can't in winter. Okay, so tip 6 is up-potting your plants and repotting them. So putting them in bigger pots when they need it. And also that helps when you repot. You can also like put new compost, new potting soil in there. You can fertilize better and easier depending on if you're restrained with your pot sizes. It's helpful just to take the plant out. You can reduce the roots a little bit on plants. About 20% is the general rule. So if you need to, you can trim roots. I like to just up pot if I need to. So my ironweed, which I'll put a picture of my ironweed pot on here, is huge. The pot is ginormous. And I noticed the plant was struggling, so I put it in a bigger pot and it just took off again. When I say struggling, I mean like just not as prolific. It still was great. So just like up potting really helps. And this is my next tip, which is tip number 7, which is fertilizing and mixing in compost. I do this once, well, I fertilize more than once, but although I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't fertilize a lot. Probably should fertilize more, but I like to add new compost / potting soil, like a mixture of the two every year in the spring. I'll like refill my pots because the soil will settle. I'll put new compost, potting soil on there, and that kind of gives it a boost. And I'll mix in fertilizer. So I really like the tones. They have different varieties. Like they have rose tone for rose plants and tomatoes. But I just got this plant tone. And the ingredients are, like it's derived from like poultry manure, bone meal, things like that. There are more natural ones too, but this one I think is a pretty good option. So this is, I believe, it's like a dry release, like it's a dry fertilizer and then the water activates it. So what I'll do is I'll mix it in with the potting soil and the compost, and then when you water it, you get the fertilizer. I then will also use liquid fertilizer too throughout the year when I'm watering the plants, but either works. Just fertilize your flowers, especially if you have a flower like my zinnia. I fertilized a couple times because it blooms throughout the year or the summer, and that'll keep it blooming. Tip number 8 is to cover your plants with mulch year round. So the entire year, even winter, actually almost especially in winter. Mulching helps suppress weeds, which aren't a huge problem in container gardening. Honestly, I just pluck them out. It's not even a big deal. And it's such a small space that weeds aren't a problem. But mulch will also help protect the soil from wind, especially if you have a high wind area. It'll keep the soil in. And the big thing it does, besides just enhancing the quality of your soil as it decomposes, is it holds in moisture and water. So it helps you from having to water as frequently. It does protect the top of the plant, especially if you have a plant that's a little more root bound, because those roots are really close to the surface. So that will help with that. Mulching in the colder months does the same thing. Again, it's just helping promote soil health because it decomposes over time. It prevents the soil from just blowing out in the wind. We get a lot of wind here in the winter. And then it also will help just keep your plants insulated. You don't want them to be too insulated because they can actually germinate again, because mulch does create a little heat, but I haven't really had a problem with that. Okay, so tip number 9 is water your plants thoroughly but less often. So you want to water the plant to the point where the water comes out the bottom of the pot, which I know can be an issue if you're not on the bottom floor and you have to contend with neighbors below you, because you don't want to dump water all over them. So what I would suggest is, again, those bigger saucers to catch the water, and just be mindful of like how much water it is. Go slow at first, but I just water until the water comes out the bottom. The reason you want to do this is because it'll help the roots of the plant go down into the pot. If you surface water only, all the roots are going to stay on the top. So you want to make sure to deep water. It also is nice because you water less often, but it's a lot more work in that moment, but you water less often. Okay, last one, tip number 10. Now this is one a lot of people wouldn't think of, but if you are container or raised bed growing and you have perennials in there, you need to water in the winter. Not very much, but a little bit. Especially like for me, like my patio doesn't get any rain and it gets very little snow because it's so well covered. So I will actually, I push my pots against the walls. So I have to go out there, usually it's like once a month if we've had no precipitation, because it gets some water. And I'll put water, I don't water thoroughly. I don't water until the water comes out the bottom of the pot. I just pour some water into the plant just to keep it alive. Because if you have a perennial outside in a garden that's not covered, they're naturally going to get rain and snow and things like that. In a container garden, it's not going to get that. So you can't let the soil get too dry for too long. So I do like to water in the winter. Okay, everybody. So those are my 10 tips for turning your patio or your deck space into a garden. If I missed anything, or if you have a tip that you would like to share, if you've done this kind of container gardening and you want to share a tip with people, please put it in the comments, because it's really nice to be able to share those ideas, because I'm sure I've missed a couple. All right, thanks for stopping by, everybody. See you next time.